All right, hi there, everyone. This is Kyle Berry again, coming to you with another lecture for week two. So, this week we're going to be looking at notation, rhythm, melody, and harmony. And just before we get started, I want to remind everyone that each week I will post slides. I will do a discussion question and a quiz, and I'll try to get these videos to you by Thursday, your time. I usually have them uploaded by the end of the evening on Wednesday, my time, but that's the middle of the night for you guys. So I try to get them to you Thursday so that you can watch these videos and go through the PowerPoints and hopefully do very well on the quizzes. As another reminder, all of the answers for everything on the quiz can always be found in these notes, right? I try to let you know when there are going to be extra material or like something you might want to look at that might be helpful in the book, but honestly most of the stuff is going to come from these slides. So without further ado, let's get into it. Notation, rhythm, melody, and harmony. So building blocks. Last week we covered pitch, dynamics, and timbre. This week we're going to be looking at, like I said, notation, rhythm, melody, and harmony. A year-long course could easily be taught about each of these subjects. I really mean that. And I'm going to do my best to leave you with like an essential understanding. But it is also important to know that as we get into the course more, and we get into the stylistic periods and that sort of thing, we will touch on these again. So we'll come back to each of these as they are treated uniquely in each of the stylistic periods we'll go over later in the term. Okay, so notation. The majority of human song has been lost to time. Just that it's most of human thought is gone, and we'll never know about it because for the longest time we couldn't write, and for the same reasons, for the longest time we had no way to jot down these songs that we came up with. But our earliest written record comes from Babylonia, present-day Iraq, and it dates back to 1400 BC. So this is in Babylonia. This is a very different part of the world from Europe, where a lot of our Western music history that we know about comes from. Over 2,000 years later, so we're talking in the current era or common era. In Europe, they still did not have a system of notation of writing down music. So it came to Babylonia far before it ever came to Europe. And we have Isidore of Seville credited with saying, and I think this is very important to this idea, is that unless sounds are held by the memory of man, they perish because they cannot be written down. So even back then they must have known that, you know, as you get older, you start to forget some of the songs you might have sung as a child, and maybe you forget to hand them down. And just like there are lost languages, we end up having lost musical material, lost songs. Who knows how many great pieces of music there are out there that we'll just never get to hear. Uh-oh. Okay, let's try that again. There we go. Notable international notation system. So actually, none of this is in the is on the quiz, but I figured it's interesting to me, and so maybe it'd be interesting to you. So if we go back, we look at back in Babylonia, they had this this slab that was actually they had chiseled into it these symbols, and each of these symbols meant a different pitch or a different musical idea. As we move forward, we have different ways of illustrating that. So India's Sumaveda text is possibly the world's oldest surviving notated melodies. These are like religious chants and things. To the far right in the black and red is the traditional Russian Orthodox notation system, which uses something similar to what we'll learn about later, these kind of squiggle lines to kind of give the general idea, like if the line goes up, it means that you sing a higher pitch, and if the line goes down, it means you sing a lower pitch, and if it wiggles in the middle, maybe you change the notes sometime around there. There's also shape note singing, which was created in the 18th century in England, but is still very popular in the southern United States, Appalachia. As the country was being founded, kind of became very popular with like Quakers and other sort of similar religious practices, and these are kind of similar to our traditional Western notation because it evolved from that. But each of these symbols relates to one of the what we call solfege pitches. So in solfege, you've probably heard do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. So one of those shapes means do, the other one means re, and so on and so forth. And so you don't necessarily have to read the notes because if you remember mi, re, so, do, if you remember the solfege notes, then you can sing it just by looking at the shapes. Modern staff notation dates back a really long time. So the earliest Western notation that we have were something called neumes. And neumes are kind of similar to the Russian tradition we looked at earlier, where it's these small markings that kind of represent the general shape of a musical idea. So if you had, we're going to use this a lot probably today, the song Mary Had a Little Lamb. Well, the beginning of that melody descends. Mary had, so you might have a line that goes down, but then it immediately rises back up. A little lamb. So you might have a line that dives at first and raises again. These were inexact. Obviously, I don't know how far to go down. I wouldn't know if that line for Mary Had a Little Lamb sounds like this, or if it sounds like this, or if it sounds like this. Right? Who knows? All I know is that it goes down and then climbs back up. So it's not the best way of relaying a musical idea, right? It had the general shape rather than the specific notes. Later, we get Guido of Arezzo. He is credited with being the father of modern staff notation. His technique arranged pitches on 4 lines. 4 lines is not quite as many lines as we have today, but it was much more similar than it was with the neumes. So he arranged pitches and had a kind of a rudimentary rhythmic system, but still he didn't have a good way of conveying rhythmic ideas. But you could now get the pitches, and this is the kind of notation here on the right that we see with like Gregorian chant. You'll still sing it in maybe certain Catholic traditions or certain high Episcopal traditions. I know I've worked as a choral scholar at different churches where we use this sort of notation for the cantor or the person who might chant at the beginning of a service. So this is still being used, but very rarely. It's mostly outdated. We've moved on since then. Modern notation has a 5-lined staff. So we see back to Guido, how he had his 4 red lines here. When we look over at ours, we have 5 lines. Okay, so it's evolved a little bit, but it looks fairly similar, doesn't it? There's still dots on the lines or on the spaces. We will look at 3 important parts of modern notation. Those 3 important parts are the staff, the clefs, and measures. And so that's what we're going to look at next. But it is important to note that our modern staff, as you can see here, has 5 lines on it, which is different. It evolved a little bit. The staff, typically monophonic instruments, meaning instruments that only play 1 note at a time, will play on a single staff. So if I had a saxophone, I would only read, it would look just like it does on the right hand side here. It'd be 1 line of music at a time because my instrument can only make 1 note at a time. The instruments read notes from left to right just like you would read a book, and it moves further to the right as the song progresses until it wraps around. It's exactly like reading the newspaper or anything in our modern language. Pitches change depending on the line or the space where they're placed. So as the dots go up, the pitch goes up, and as they go down, the pitch descends, right? We have ways of portraying every playable note of every instrument. If the note continues to go far above the top line, then we add what are called ledger lines, so that we can extend the staff, which are tiny little lines. And the same thing if it goes below. We add tiny little lines below that are called ledger lines. You can look at drawing the staff if you want to get extra practice on page 29 of your textbook. Again, it it reminds me of one of those things like when you're a kid in school and you're first learning to do your alphabet, and it has kind of the dotted line, and you fill it in and practice a few times writing it. That's the sort of thing that's in your textbook. The grand staff is different. So whereas a single staff like this is for a monophonic instrument or someone who's playing one note at a time, and we can see here there's one note after another, right? There are no notes on top of each other here. As we go to the grand staff, you can get music where you need to play more than one note at a time. In the situation of a piano, like I'm sitting in front of right now, the lines on the bottom, so the bottom 5 lines are depict what your left hand does, which are usually the lower notes. And then the staff on top, which is the treble clef, depicts, oh, that's weird. I'm so sorry about that, technical difficulties. Here we go. Cool. Okay, so the staff on the bottom depicts what your left hand does, the staff on the right depicts what your right hand does. Polyphonic instruments usually play on this, as well as choral musicians often will sing by looking at multiple staffs at once. For choral musicians, it's important because it can help me to hear the other people and see what they're doing, and I can see how my note that I'm singing relates to the other notes that they're singing. Whereas for instruments, they don't have to rely on their ear as much as a choral musician. They just know if they hit the right key or press the right button or put their finger in the right spot, it will play the right note. The grand staff combines 2 staves, one on the top and one on the bottom, and as we said, the bottom one is the lower pitches and the top one is the higher pitches. Yeah, and you can practice drawing the grand staff on page 36. Okay, you should notice that here on the grand staff on the far left, or even on a regular staff on the far left, there's a symbol there. You kind of have this curly, squiggly thing that you see all over the place. Whenever there's like a music shop, you'll see these symbols. And the bass clef, which kind of looks like a sideways, frowny face, is there as well. But there's some other ones you might want to be aware of. These little symbols that are onto the far left of the staff are called clefs. And a clef is a musical symbol that when placed on a staff indicates the order of the pitches. So if I have the top line of the treble clef, I know that that is an F note. If I have the top line of the bass clef, I know that that is an A note. Right? These are very different. So it really matters which note that you have there. The top line of the alto clef is a G note. And the top line of a tenor clef is a E note. Right? So these are the 4 most common. There are other ones out there, but 90% of the time, these are the only ones. Actually, 99% of the times, these are the only ones that you'll see. Different instruments use different clefs depending on the situation. But for ease of reading, composers will often choose a clef that can accommodate the largest number of pitches on the staff without us having to add those ledger lines I was talking about. It's much easier for the musician if all the music they have to play falls within the 5 lines of the staff. If it goes too far above or too far below, it can get difficult to read. And so I, when writing music, will pick a clef that most adequately fits those pitches on there. Okay, measures. So you'll notice here, in this musical line, that there's a couple notes and then there'll be a vertical line, and there's another note and a vertical line, and then about 3 notes and a vertical line, and so on and so forth. These are called measures, or bars, depending on who you're talking to. In jazz, we say bars a lot. You might hear in hip-hop people might say he has bars, she has bars. What they're talking about is measures, like that person can rap for multiple measures at a time. So a bar or a measure is a segment of music that groups together a specific number of beats. A measure is defined by vertical lines, which we talked about, that divide the staff, and measures are helpful for creating a sense of phrasing and rhythmic consistency. in a composition. So I know when I see these bars that each bar contains 3 beats in this example that we see down here. Just in case you're confused, you can kind of count for yourself that the example we're looking at here has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 measures in it, right? The vertical lines divide the staff up, so I can see 7 measures here. Other common modern notation systems, if you're a guitar player, I know that I taught myself to play guitar when I was a teenager using Guitar Tab, which is very popular. Guitar Tab on the left here is a pictorial representation of the frets on a guitar. And so I can see the strings that are laid out from left to right. It kind of looks a little bit deceivingly like a normal staff, but these represent the strings from the low E to the high E on a guitar. And then it tells me on each string what note that I hold down to play whatever it wants me to play, right? I will say Guitar Tab isn't great at depicting rhythm, but it can be very helpful as a learning tool for the instrument and learning where to put your fingers, how to play things, and as long as you know the rhythm of the song you're trying to play, it can be helpful. There have been attempts to add rhythmic notation to Guitar Tab. To my knowledge, it hasn't caught on yet, but that might be coming. And then on the right-hand side, we have what's called piano roll. It's called piano roll for a number of reasons. First, if you look at this picture on the right-hand side, you can see that there's a piano running up the left-hand side of the picture. But also, if you've ever seen a player piano from back in the day, turn of the century, player piano used to use these scrolls that you would load into the player piano, and they were punched full of holes. So if you imagine all these dots on these pictures as holes, when you would feed one of these things into player piano, as the roll spun, based on where the holes were, the player piano would know what notes to play for itself. And so this is the same. If I'm in a digital audio workstation, I'm working on electronic music, I can use a piano roll to tell the computer what notes I want it to play for whatever instrument. So you click these little blocks in, and depending on how long they are and where they are, up or down, the program will know exactly what note and what rhythm I wanted to play. So these are very helpful. I teach a class at the moment to my students at the school I work at, and we use this notation system a lot, actually. We use it more than the standard notation system. Okay. Okay. Rhythm. So without getting overly technical, rhythm is most easily thought of as a pulse of music. Often these pulses are repeated, forming patterns for fixed durations. So if I play something here on the piano, I'm just going to make something up. You could probably feel as you listen to that there's a pulse. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1. Your body probably naturally felt that pulse. So that's basically what rhythm is. Most of our rhythm, as we'll find out here in a second, can be divided as thought of as either a duple or a triple meter. The one we just listened to is in triple because it's in groups of 3. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1. Cool. There's another chance for you to practice writing rhythms and common rhythm notations in your book from page 41 to 43. So as I mentioned, duple meter, and I've added some videos here that you can watch. But rhythm is typically divided into rhythms that can be felt as being divided into either groups of 2, 4, or 8, which we call duple meter, so groupings of 2, or into triple meter, which is groupings of 3. So that would be 3. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. But if I wanted to play something in duple, if I want to take this same thing and make it duple, I could do something like this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. Yeah? All types of music can either be divided into groups of 2. If you have a drum beat like the one here, it would go 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and boom, boom, 4 and. The Blue Danube waltz that I put here, everyone will know. Ba da 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 da. 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 3. Most waltzes, all waltzes, are in triple meter, and so when I hear triple meter, I typically think waltz. But I would invite you guys to listen to these in your own time and kind of get the feel in your body. Rhythm is most useful when it's felt or when it's internalized, and I think that those will give you some good example of that. There are things like irregular meter. So irregular meter occurs when rhythmic ideas don't fall equally into groups of 2 or groups of 3. Rhythms based on groupings of 5 or 7 or 11 are often called irregular meters. You can also have 13s and 15s, and or I guess maybe not 15s, 13s, 17s. That also fit irregular meter, but 5, 7, and 11 are the most common. Musicians typically count these by dissecting them down into groups of 2 and 3. So for instance, if I had a song in 5, rather than counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, most musicians will, depending on the melody, will count it as 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, or 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. And because those still add up to 5, that's how we would count it. I'm just thinking, here's an example of something that's in an irregular meter. So here. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Right? I would probably count that most of the time as 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, is how most musicians would probably count that. It most of the time makes it easier to feel the musical line. There are musical lines that are longer and might be more helpful to count as 5 or as 7, but most of the time it's easier to break them down into smaller parts. Our rhythmic system, and again, I'm going to avoid getting to the complexities of this because it can get really complicated, but our rhythmic system is based on subdivision. And when I say ours, I mean Western rhythmic notation, is based on subdivision of the rhythmic hierarchy model. So each note can be split into 2 halves to create notes that are equal length but are half as long as the original. So for instance, if I played this, I'm going to play it for what's called a whole note, which is one of our longest notes, and it lasts for 4 beats, so it would sound like something like this. 1, 2, 3, 4. That's 4 beats. 1, 2, 3, 4. Well, according to this chart, I can break that whole note down into 2 half notes. It'll take up the same amount of time, but this time each note will only get 2 beats. 1, 2, 3, 4. Or I can break that down into 4 quarter notes. 1, 2, 3, 4. Or eighth notes. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and. Or 16th notes. This would be fast, but I'll try. 1E and a 2E and a 3E and a 4E and a. I'm a little offbeat there, but you get the idea. Each one is divided into equal parts. it's really nice that in America we use things like whole, half, quarter, eighth, 16th, because it's very easy to know that if I have a 16th note, 16 of them fit into one whole note. Or if I have a quarter note, 4 of those fit into one whole note. In other countries, when I was studying in the UK, they use terms like brevs and semi-brevs and quavers and crotchets, which don't make nearly as much sense. I like our system better because it very clearly depicts this subdivision model that we work off of. There are rhythms that are popular around the world, such as polyrhythms. And as the name suggests, a polyrhythm is when you have 2 overlapping rhythmic ideas that are playing at the same time. So rather than having an irregular meter that's like 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, what if instead if I had a rhythm that was a duple meter playing at the same time as a rhythm that's in a triple meter? We know that there are certain sync points where these rhythms will sync up. So I know that in the time it takes my triple meter to play twice, that would be 6 beats. That would it would take my duple meter to play 3 times, because 2 times 3 is also 6. So these things do have sync points, but polyrhythms are really interesting. They come particularly from the sub-Saharan African tradition, and are very prevalent in the music there, but they exist all around the world. This is a great video using body percussion that you guys can watch that kind of explains and allows you to watch that polyrhythmic idea. So here you'll see at different points, these 4 guys will all be making a different rhythm that all layer over each other to completely which create these really complex rhythmic ideas. Next we have melody. So melody is a part of the song that we find ourselves singing later. So melody is most easily thought of as the higher pitch, or the one that you hear people singing by themselves as a solo. If we use the example, Mary Had a Little Lamb, then the melody would be... a little bit later we'll talk about harmony that goes with that. Right? But you don't sing this part. Do you? No. The melody is this part. Mary had a little lamb. So the melody is most often the loudest part in a song. It usually has the lyrics involved with it, or it's the highest pitched, mostly because our ears are very good at picking out the higher and the lowest pitches. So melody typically will sit often in the highest pitch. To explain it any further would just be incredibly confusing. I think it's one of those things that most people know it when they hear it. You'll be able to pick out what melody is. Okay. And I really apologize. I don't know why this is acting the way that it's acting. Here we go. Counterpoint. Lovely. So, as the combination of multiple rhythms played simultaneously is called polyrhythms, we have multiple rhythms going at once. The playing of multiple melodies in conjunction with one another is called counterpoint. As an example, this is a great piece written by Benjamin Britten. It's called The Young Person's Guide to the Orchestra. And so what Britten attempted to do when he wrote this piece was to pick out what he thought were all the different important parts of an orchestra that a young person should know about. So there are pieces that display the brass and the woodwinds and the strings and the percussion. But one of the things he displays is counterpoint. And so it allows you to listen. So if I ever have multiple melodic ideas playing at once, it can be referred to as counterpoint. Now, there's also the idea of counterpoint coming from the 17th century. which describes a number of rules that are used to create musical pieces. They're very strict. There are guidelines that one should follow when writing something. But for our purposes, that's not exactly what we're talking about. We're talking about multiple lines of music. So if I had this playing, that could be one. And if I had another one, a line playing that maybe sounded like this, let's see what those would sound like. Right, so you can kind of hear them layer over each other. Later in the listening examples, I have some Bach, I think, for you, with some counterpoint and some other examples. Listening to this video, though, with the Britten, I think it's really nice, because if you pay close attention, you'll hear that one of the higher-pitched instruments, I think either a flute or maybe a piccolo, comes in playing motive at the beginning, and then slowly as it goes through, you'll hear that motive repeated over and over, but by different instruments, while those previous instruments move on to different things, and they all overlap, and it's beautiful. Which brings us to harmony. So when multiple pitches are sounded at the same time, so if I don't just play one, but if I add some to it, we call that harmony, when they're sounded at the same time. Right? Harmony is one of my favorite parts of music. I like it so much because I think harmony is really important for the way that we contextualize music. Our modern ears are really accepting of dissonances, and so we can get these really great chords like this, or like this. Which have lots of notes that are right next to each other, which are kind of overlapping. But these sorts of sounds, even though we might think of them as really beautiful today, these weren't always thought of as beautiful. For the longest time, music was only one line, and so if we go back to our Mary Had a Little Lamb example, music would have sounded just like that. And then eventually, our ears developed that we started to like the sound of an octave. So maybe we would add a note up on top and we'd play it like this. And as time went on, we became more accepting of other intervals. So maybe the fifth got added in. This is why a lot of Gregorian chant music sounds like they sing on fifths of each other. Later, we adopted fourths. And eventually our ear got so used to different dissonances that we could add in whole chords underneath, so an accompaniment to the melody. Right? But harmony can also be used to kind of play around with the ways things sound. So what if I put this, instead of being in a happy key, like C major, what if I put it into C minor? If I played this but in C minor, by changing just a couple notes, it would sound sort of like this. Mary doesn't sound so happy about her lamb anymore, does she? Right? That's just by changing one note, right? And I can change the whole way that that sounds. There's tons and tons of different ways that you could harmonize different songs. And to give you an idea of what a huge impact harmony has on a song, I have uploaded this great version of the YMCA. Everybody loves the YMCA, but it's in a minor key, and it is magnificent. I really hope you enjoy it. It's great. It would you'll never hear the song the same way. It's got such a different character just by changing the harmonization of the notes. Okay, a little harmony extra. I love both of these guys that are pictured here. Jacob Collier is on the left, and Herbie Hancock, one of the greatest jazz musicians of all time, still living. If you get the chance ever to go see him while he's still around, you got to do that. You owe it to yourself. A living legend. But Jacob Collier here on the left is a British musician. He's won multiple Grammy Awards for his, specifically for his arrangements of songs. He plays around with harmony a lot, and in this video, it's part of a series where experts in something come and explain a topic in five different layers of difficulty. And so he starts off with like a child, and then a teenager, a college student, a graduate student, and then an expert. And he explains harmony each time in a different way. And I think it can be really useful to watch. Okay, and then we end up with our key terms, which you can look over at your leisure, which will be I'll go ahead and tell you most of the quiz comes from these key terms. And then some listening examples. So if you're interested on your own time, come here and click through these. We've got everything from Guido, who we mentioned back at the beginning, to the Samaveda that we mentioned also, the Indian prayer book, all the way to some Jacob Collier, like I just mentioned, Miles Davis, Beyonce, of course. And when you're listening to each of these, I kind of have marked what I want you listening for. So in the first three, these are examples of early musical notation and what early music sounded like. So we're talking about BC, right? Like long time ago, ancient human music. And it's really cool to reconnect to that. When we get into the blue, Take 5, and Tom Sawyer by Rush, again, great song. These, I want you to listen to rhythm. And Tom Sawyer in particular, I think it's the instrumental riff that happens like halfway through. This is an example of 7, a melody that's written into an irregular meter. And Take 5 is probably one of the most famous jazz songs of all time, but also opened the American ear back in 1959 to the idea of irregular meters. Love on Top I love because I think it's one of those melodies that gets stuck in your head as it modulates upwards and upwards and upwards. One of Beyonce's best songs in my opinion. And then finally at the end here with So What and Moon River, these are examples of incredible harmony. With Miles Davis, it's great examples of what we call modal harmony. He introduced modal jazz, which is kind of a very particular kind of harmonization or technique for harmonization. And then Moon River, plug this up to your best speakers in your house. It starts off a little slow, I'll admit, but by the time you get through it, I mean, it'll put a workout on whatever you're listening to it on. It is a very lush arrangement of a beautiful song, and I think you guys will enjoy it. That's everything I've got for you. I hope this helped. I'm sorry for the technical difficulties as well. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me, and I'll upload some new slides and a whole new week's worth of stuff on Sunday night for you guys to get started on. All right, I hope everyone's doing well, and please never hesitate to reach out. Kyle.berry at hgtc.edu.